All right, guys, welcome back to another Wednesday live training. We have got a monster show this week and next week. I'm going to be talking all about your blind spots, all about cognitive dissonance, and why the brain is actually wired in a way to make us not be able to see our blind spots, which is why it's so difficult for people to change and why many of you might be experiencing issues or the same reoccurring conflicts in your relationships with your spouse, with your children, and even with yourself. You might see yourself making the same mistakes and you're like, man, why do I keep doing this? Well, we're going to get into the science of like what is actually happening in the brain. We're going to talk about why cognitive dissonance is destroying your relationship, what's actually happening in the brain, and like I said, why we can't see our blind spots, how our brain actually reconstructs memories incorrectly, which again furthers the point that you don't even know that you're making these mistakes because your memory is holding a bias that you're always right. So there's this self-justification brain that's going on. And then we're going to talk about how to actually prevent it in today's training. How can we prevent this cognitive dissonance? How can we start to see those blind spots a little bit and really get kind of a check and balance system so that we don't keep making the same mistakes? Because I don't think we want to be here. But as you know, these reoccurring relationships, these reoccurring problems that we face in our relationships, a lot of times we put a lot of meaning behind them. Like, oh my God, like, why does she always do this? Why can't she see this? I've explained this so many times. How can she not understand that she's hurting my feelings? Or how can she not see that we just talked about this and the issue is still an issue? And so we're going to get into that. And I think for me, at least, the more I understand about the brain and what's actually happening two big things happen. Number one is I realize how fallible I am and how just human I am to be making these mistakes. So when I am confronted with my own biases or Joel, you might be wrong, it gives me a time to kind of reflect and go, maybe you're right. Maybe I am making a mistake. Let me take some introspection. Let me ask other people. And then the second thing, it gives me a lot of compassion towards my wife and even towards others and just go, oh, you're actually not doing this to me on purpose. You literally just cannot see what's going on. Your brain is biased to not seeing that. And if it makes a lot of sense, because if we were to prove and admit that we were wrong about something and we know we've been doing it for such a long time, that would say a lot about our identity. That would say a lot about our belief system and everything that we have up until this point believed to be true. And now in one moment, someone is going to destroy all of that. And so it makes perfect sense when you actually start to think about why the brain is biased and we have these confirmation biases, right, that prevent us from seeing the truth. So that's what we're going to get into today. If you guys don't know me and this is like your first time tuning in, just a quick intro. My name is 𝘲𝘪𝘳𝘦. I'm a best-selling author. I was a former first responder for 15 years. So any of you that have worked very stressful jobs or shift work or just trying to manage work-life balance, I know what that's like, and I know what it's like on the family. And that took a toll on my marriage. For almost 10 years, my wife and I had this up and down roller coaster relationship. And finally, she asked me, like, you need to change. You need to get things better. And this was already after doing 4 years of therapy. And I didn't think it could get better. But when she asked me to go deep, I took one more time. I took one more time to see, like, can I get better? Is this a problem? Am I the problem? Or is she the problem? Or the kids the problem? And I didn't want to fix it. But I did, and I was able to, and I was surprised, honestly, that I was able to do it so quickly. And I was able to change my relationship, my marriage, my connection with my kids after just 3 months of doing the work. And that set me on a path to help others do the same. So if you're interested in learning more on how I do that with my coaching, my group coaching, feel free to reach out and drop me a line, and I'll tell you all about that. All right, let's get into the training. Okay, mistakes were made, but not by you, right? Now, cognitive dissonance, what is that? It's a state of tension that occurs whenever a person holds two cognitions, which is ideas, attitudes, beliefs, opinions, that are psychologically inconsistent, such as smoking is dumb to do because it could kill me, but I smoke 2 packs a day. So dissonance produces this mental discomfort, and that ranges from just minor things to deep, deep pain. And people don't rest easy until they can find a way to reduce it. So what's actually going on in the brain? Well, neuroscientists have recently shown that these biases in thinking are built into the very way the brain processes information. So, for example, there was a study of people who were being monitored by this magnetic resonance imaging, MRI. And while they were trying to process dissonant or consonant information about George Bush and John Kerry, and they found that the reasoning areas of the brain virtually shut down when participants were confronted with dissonant information, and the emotion circuits of the brain lit up happily when the continence was restored. So these mechanisms, they actually provide a neurological basis for the observation that once our minds are made up, it's really hard to change them. Now let's talk about memory and how we actually reconstruct it and why it's probably not helpful. So if mistakes were made, they were probably made by someone else, and we were just innocent bystanders. That's the idea. Matter of fact, Nietzsche, the great philosopher, said, "I have done that, say my memory. I cannot have done that, says my pride." Because memory is reconstructive. It is subject to confabulation. Confusing an event that happened to someone else with one that happened to you, or coming to believe that you remember something that never happened at all. Now, adolescents and their parents, they actually did a study, and they came into the lab and they filled out a whole bunch of forms listing typical topics of disagreement: personal appearance, curfews, fighting with their siblings, the usual stuff. And next, each adolescent had a 10-minute session with each parent separately to discuss and try to resolve their greatest areas of disagreement. Finally, the teenagers rated how they felt about the conflict, how intense their emotions were about their attitudes towards their parents, and so on. 6 weeks later, they were asked to recall and rate again the conflict and the reactions to it. The teenagers who felt close to their parents remembered the quarrel as having been less intense and conflicted than they reported at the time. But the teenagers who felt ambivalent and remote from their parents remembered the conflict as having been angrier and more bitter than they rated at the time. So if memory is central to your identity, a self-serving distortion is probably even more likely. A self-serving memory distortion is getting what you want by revising what you had. So we misremember our history as being worse than it was, and this distorts our perception of how much we have improved to feel better about ourselves now. And of course, all of us do grow up and mature, but generally not really as much as we think. And this bias in memory explains why many of us feel that we've changed so profoundly, but our friends and our enemies and our loved ones, they're the same old friends and enemies and the loves, and they just the same as they always were. I mean, think about like high school reunions. You run into Harry at a high school reunion, and Harry's describing how much he's learned and grown since graduation. But every one of us is just nodding our head and saying to ourselves, yeah, same old Harry, a little fatter, little balder. So false memories allow us to forgive ourselves and justify our mistakes, but sometimes at a really high price, an inability to take responsibility for our lives. And one of the most powerful stories that many people wish to live by is the victim narrative. Nobody has actually been abducted by aliens, even though a lot of them will tell you that, oh yeah, that this has happened to me, and they tell you like it was actually really happening. But millions, we can agree, have survived cruelties of children, neglect, sexual abuse, parental alcoholism, violence, all these things. Because these accounts are so emotionally powerful that thousands of people have been drawn to construct Me Too versions of them. And so memories of abuse help them resolve their dissonance between I'm smart and capable, and my life is sure a mess right now, with an explanation that makes them feel good and removes all the responsibility. It's not my fault. My life is a mess. Just look at what they did to me. Now, let's get into the science, and let's talk about memory reconstruction and how it may have gone bad. And I just illustrated like how people talk about aliens, right? Even though it probably never happened. Now, Sina Garvin ran an experiment with preschool children. So a man comes in, he reads them a whole bunch of stories, hands out some treats. He did nothing aggressive or surprising. A week later, an interviewer asked the group leading questions. Did he shove the teacher? Did he throw a crayon at the kid who was talking? She asked a second group of questions using influence techniques such as telling the children what other kids had supposedly said, expressing disappointment if their answers were negative, and praising children for making allegations. In the first group, children said, yes, it happened, to about 15% of the false allegations about the man's visit. In the second group, the 3-year-olds said, yes, it happened, to over 80% of false allegations. And the 4 to 6-year-olds, about 50%. Okay, the interviews were only 5 to 10 minutes. Now, a similar study was done with 5 to 7-year-olds using these preposterous questions like, did Paco take you flying on an airplane? And what's more troubling is that within a short amount of time, the children's inaccurate statements crystallized into stable but false memories. This is how the brain is tricking you guys. So be very careful thinking whatever your memory is about a traumatic event actually really did happen. Okay, because people become more certain that they are right about something, especially if they just did it and they know they can't undo it, okay? So investigators, for example, they asked everyone, how certain they were that their horse would win. And this is right after they like put a bet on the horse track. And the bettors who had placed their bets were far more certain about their choice than were the folks waiting in line. Nothing had changed. It was just the finality of the bet. So when you do anything that harms someone else, or you get them in trouble, you verbally abuse them, you punch them. I mean, imagine getting in an argument with your wife or your children. A powerful new factor comes into play, and that is the need to justify whatever you just did. You know, imagine just like a boy who's going along with his group of seventh graders and they're taunting and they're bullying other fellow seventh graders. They're going to immediately, if you question them, they're going to immediately say like, oh, I had to do that because, you know, so-and-so was making me do it. Or they'll come up with a way to minimize whatever they did. And just remember, there is a key formula here about this vicious cycle. And that is aggression begets self-justification, which begets more aggression. Okay. There is a really telling part and that when we look at the brain, and I think this is really critical for any guy out there, especially good men, and you think you're a very honest man and you have an ethical compass, but maybe you've slipped, maybe you've tripped along the way. Guess what? How do you get an honest man to lose his ethical compass? Easy. You get him to take one step at a time, and self-justification will do the rest. So the question really then comes in, how do we break our bias? How do we break this dissonance? To break the self-justification habit, we need to be more mindful of our behavior and the reasons for our choices. This is going to take time. It's going to take self-reflection and willingness. But there is this naive realism, and that is the inescapable conviction that we perceive objects and events as they really are. And we assume that other people, other reasonable people, see things the same way we do. And so if they disagree with us, they obviously aren't seeing things correctly. Number one, people who are open-minded and fair, they ought to agree with a reasonable opinion. I'm reasonable. And number two, any opinion I hold must be reasonable. So if it weren't, I wouldn't hold it, which is why it makes it so difficult, guys, to actually see someone's other point of view because of those two factors. And so introspection, it doesn't work because even though we think we're doing a lot of self-reflection and that we are reasonable people, and so I have all this self-awareness. Look at me. I have all these life coaching certs. I've written a book. I've read all these books. Guess what? None of it matters because it just confirms our self-justifying beliefs. Blind spots enhance our pride and they activate our prejudices. This is crucial. We need a few trusted naysayers in our lives, coaches, critics, who are willing to puncture our protective bubble of self-justification and just yank us back to reality if we veer too far off. And this is especially important for people in positions of power. Guys, I hope you enjoyed this week's training. Next week, we're going to go a little bit further and we're going to talk about how cognitive dissonance and biases and how this filtrates into our relationships, into our marriages, and how we can self-correct even more. I hope you like this training. If you do, leave me a comment. Let me know what you like most. Let me know what you want to see in future videos. I rely a lot on you guys and all the interaction that you give me. That fuels me to keep doing this. I'm on a mission to help empower men build unshakable marriages and deeper connection with their kids. If this is something that interests you, reach out, drop me a line, and I'll get you guys the details. Have an amazing rest of your week. Can't wait to see you next week.